Welcome to the NORR 2024 speakers that this year will each address the state of the future of architecture and engineering. I'm Silvio Baldessera, Chair Emeritus of NORR, founder of NORR, and your host. NORR is a continuing education program founded 17 years ago, and the three main goals are to teach, learn, improve, and to do that continuously. The program relies on bringing the best speakers in three series: architecture, engineering, and masters. Each of these NORR virtual sessions since 2020 have been recorded and are available on NORR YouTube for global access. Welcome to the 13 NORR office staff and invited guests. Welcome also to the students from 16 schools of architecture from Canada, the US, the UK, and Europe. For every city, there is an architectural turning point in history. For Toronto, the city that NORR was founded in 1938 as John B. Parkin, that turning point was the 60s. In 1967, the 56-story Toronto Bank Tower, and in 1969, the 46-story Royal Trust Tower brought the international style to the core of downtown Toronto. That marked the change of architecture forever, not just in Toronto, but in Canada. Designed by modernist Mies van der Rohe in association with John B. Parkin and Bregman and Hammond architects, the center was commissioned by Alan Lambert, chair of the TD Bank, in partnership with Fairview Corporation. Phyllis Lambert, sister-in-law of Alan Lambert and member of the Brofman family, was an advisor to the TD Center competition. Phyllis had been the director of planning on the Seagrams building that Mies van der Rohe was the architect for. Phyllis, in her book, Mies in America, wrote, and I quote, "With the Toronto Dominion Center, Mies realized an architecture of movement, and yet at the same time thought the proportional relations of a parts and whole, and through the restrained use of fine materials, this is also the architecture of repose," end of quote. The TD Center, 1963 to 1969, became the last major work of Mies van der Rohe. As American architect Philip Johnson said, quote, "The TD Center is the biggest Mies in the world," end of quote. It is an honor for NORR today to have as our guest on Mies van der Rohe his grandson, architect Dirk Lohan. Dirk Lohan studied architecture at both the Illinois Institute of Technology and the Tischchen Universität in Munich, Germany. In 1962, he came permanently to Chicago and worked in the office of his grandfather, Mies van der Rohe, until Mies's death in 1969. During these years, Dirk Lohan worked on many important projects, notably the new National Gallery in Berlin. Over his lifetime, Dirk Lohan has produced an impressive portfolio of building designs and master plans for public, corporate, and private use. Dirk Lohan's achievements in architecture have been recognized with several prestigious awards, including his appointment as a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. I want to welcome Dirk Lohan to present Mies van der Rohe. Dirk.
Silvio, thank you very much. It is a pleasure and an honor to be speaking to you all today. And I have to tell you that when I agreed to do this, I had no idea I would be worldwide broadcast around today. I thought we would talk about Chicago and maybe Toronto. But anyway, it's a pleasure, and uh, I have great admiration for your organization and the fact that you've been able to build a worldwide uh, company and that you have this very prestigious lecture series that I am today part of. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. Okay. Well, we've titled the talk "Learning from the Past, Mies and Me," because it is a story about him and my uh, coming of age and becoming an architect myself. I should tell you, just so you're clear on this, my mother was his second daughter, Marianne, and I was born the year he left Germany to go to the United States, 1938. So I'm seriously aged today, and maybe I'm at the point of becoming a little wiser than I have been in the past. These are my great grandparents, Mies's parents, father and mother. And as is well known, he grew up or he was born in the town of Aachen, Aachen, in Germany on the border to Holland and Belgium. Very close. In fact, the street where he was born, the house, was in walking distance to the Dutch border. And Mies, as a young man, learned a little bit of Dutch and later even spent half a year in Holland working on the Kröller-Müller Museum, but that's another story. This picture here is the 800 or 1,000-year-old Romanesque um, cathedral that was the beginning of a series of buildings over the centuries. And Mies was fond of talking about going, invited by his mother, who was Catholic, to the services in this building. And instead of listening to the mostly Latin sermons, he looked at the stonework and the architecture of the arches and how everything was built and put together. He remembered it very well. This building was followed later on by a Gothic cathedral, or uh, not cathedral really, a chapel, a very large one that is attached to it. And it's amazing how these two styles have been merged into one building. And Aachen became, in the Middle Ages, sort of the capital of Europe, with Charlemagne residing and ruling from that town. Next. Yeah, I this is I have to chuckle because this picture that I'm showing you now is a very important aspect of Mises' life. It's the trade school. He went to trade school as a young man and not to college or university ever. So here you see people in Aachen working and learning how to work on metal. Um, and this picture I received yesterday by total coincidence from a woman who's doing research in Aachen, his hometown, and what he went through and where there might be pictures of him. And she suspects that Mies is in this group of young men in this trade school here. And she sent it to me to see if I can identify him. But to the best of my knowledge, I cannot do that. No, I don't know that there are people who can identify the childhood images of their grandparents very easily. It's a difficult task. Mies was the product of practical learning in Aachen. His father had a stone mason's shop and was doing decorative elements on cemeteries and on churches and on buildings. And in the 60s, when his brother, his older brother, was still alive and still had the shop, um, where they worked on stone details. He took me around a walk of Aachen and pointed out right and left and up and down the streets all the little details and embellishments that he and his shop had been doing. Mies, in other words, was, you could say, an unusual success story to become an architect without having studied architecture. He learned it the practical way, making a wall building with brick and wood and tiles and concrete. And his very first project, would you believe it, is this. These two pictures are the same building. One is on the streets level, and the other one on the garden level, where you see a sloping lawn going pretty straight down. That was his very first building, and how old was he? 21 years old. And here you see the proud young architect standing at the entrance of that building, the Real House. Real, Professor Real was a professor of philosophy at the university in Berlin. And Mies used to tell me stories about being exposed to society life and having to buy proper shoes and suits to go to the parties. And he also met there at this house that he already had designed his wife, my grandmother, Ada Brun from Berlin. Here you see him, arms crossed, and on his right hand, if you carefully look, you see even a cigar between two fingers, which was a trademark of Mies van der Rohe. He loved cigars all his life, smoked till he died, and was famous for that. And in America, where he arrived without speaking English originally, he used the cigar, pulling on his cigar and puffing a little bit to formulate a sentence or an answer to a question he received in English, because it took him some time to do that. The early architecture was sort of traditional, classical, major private homes, you could say mansions. This is the residence of a major bank president, Orbic House in Potsdam, outside Berlin. It is still existing today, just like you see it here. It has been restored, and it's very much in demand, and is owned by people with understanding and appreciation. What is interesting about this house, I always find that fascinating. There's a very famous picture that was taken on the terrace here of the three Allied leaders, Churchill, Stalin, and was it Roosevelt or Truman already? I think it was already Truman for the Potsdam Conference. Churchill lived in this house during the Potsdam Conference. Next. Mies built probably, I don't know exactly how many, but in Berlin, at that time, one house after another. He became quite quickly and successful. And it's amazing that people trusted him to do this. But of course, the first house was a success, and it's still standing today, and it's a museum today. Um, Here you see one of his hand sketches, and obviously he had a talent for that too. Um, Already as a very young emerging architect, he began rather quickly in the after World War One, so 1820, 1920, at that time, to be attracted to the emerging modern theories and uh, design aspects. And here you see large glass walls, floor to ceiling, um, with a sculpture in black. And on the right, in the distance, you could even see a sailboat on a lake. So, I mean, these kinds of sketches, obviously, together with his knowledge of materials, stone he was very familiar with, brick, concrete, etc. And then he took a real liking to working with glass. Um, he was the second son. His father had another brother, another son, his brother, who it was understood and was the tradition for centuries that the firstborn son would inherit the business or the shop of her father. And this brother of his was always the one that took over the stonemason shop. But they were good, Mies and he got along very well. But Mies decided he can't stay in Aachen and he should go to the big city, Berlin, where everything was happening. Aachen was a little bit of a provincial town at the time, but there was a big department store being built, and the office, the engineering and architecture office, had been sent from Berlin, and he met some people and worked in that office with some people from Berlin who told him all about Berlin and made recommendations and introduced him to some of the leading figures in the field of architecture. And so he moved to Berlin um, in the early 20s. And here you see two of his famous design proposals. They were never built. Glass skyscrapers for Berlin, where there were no skyscrapers. Obviously, there was an influence and an admiration for what was going on in America. The building on the left is a wonderful charcoal drawing that is now in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The original is still there. And the one on the right is for the same location at a railroad station, which was the crossing point between East and West Berlin for after World War II. This building on the right, he worked on working with the reflection of the glass to make the curves and recesses pleasant to his eye. And there is a building in Chicago called Lake Point Tower that is very much a takeoff on this idea, done by two of his students here in Chicago. In the late 20s, then, he had made a gradual shift from the traditional classic architectural homes and buildings to modernism. He wanted to be an architect of the new era and he had made a contact with somebody in the foreign ministry in the 1929 for the World's Fair in Barcelona. Um, this gentleman, the foreign ministry, discussed with him the fact that France and England each had pavilions planned for the World's Fair in Barcelona, and Germany needs also a pavilion. And Mies said, "What is a pavilion? What is that?" And he said, "Well, I don't know myself, but it's supposed to show the artistic and architectural quality of a nation." And so Mies designed the Barcelona Pavilion, which was a very small building, really, without any particular reference to any products, or there was no marketing involved. It was just an image of a piece of architecture that represented the new thinking. And one element or one aspect that he was fond of and used repeatedly thereafter was the separation of the structure from the walls. In other words, the walls were not load-bearing walls, they were space division walls. And you see that here. The columns are chrome covered, and there's a little courtyard with a pool and a fountain by Erich Kolbe, an artist he knew personally in Berlin, and of course the green Tinos marble all around. The Barcelona pavilion was was removed after the exhibition because it was a World's Fair and these buildings were temporary. But it had made an impact that people and architects anywhere and everywhere always asked about it. And in the mid-60s, a group of architects in Barcelona made a real effort to rebuild the Barcelona Pavilion. And it now does exist and is a major attraction. Next. Another famous house, the Tugendhat House in Brno, southern Czechoslovakia, just across the border not far from Vienna, from Austria. It's an industrial town, and there was a German-speaking Jewish family, the Tugendhats, and they hired him. They had met him in Berlin because they used to go in the winter to Berlin to go to the symphony and to the theaters and so on. And he designed this house, which is the first major modern house to live in and to use that he did. And it is now a international, what is this title called? International landmark, World Heritage House, yes. I've been there a number of times, and one of the daughters of that family lives in Vienna, and they have been involved. The house has become a museum. This is the living room with the sculpture you see here by Lehmbruck, a German artist. The columns are again freestanding, separated from the walls. The curved wall behind the black ebony wood is where the dining room is located, with a custom designed dining table. And the drapes, the curtains are covering floor to ceiling glass walls. And even then, in 1929, these glass walls could be removed with a push button to go down into the basement, and the living room became sort of a terrace overlooking the garden and the valley. The view was into a big valley and on the other side of the valley on the mountain there, directly in full view of this living room, is a famous castle, an old castle. So the Tugendhat house was highly regarded and made him famous. He became famous because of these glass skyscrapers in Berlin and these two, the pavilion and the Tugendhat house. And of course, we all know that in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, they had a cultural program which didn't like modernism. They didn't think that was a German movement. And many artists gradually left the country bit by bit because they couldn't work anymore. And the same thing can be said about Mies. He took a trip in 1937 to the United States, which was still possible at that time. And a year later, he decided to move himself to Chicago, where he had been offered a position at the Armour Institute of Technology, which is now the Illinois Institute of Technology. By the way, the picture of him that you see here, this is what he looked like at the age of 50 years old, which is 1936 or so. I was born just in 1938 before he left, so he saw me, and I'm sorry to say that I don't remember meeting him at that time. But I met him again later, and I will talk about that in a minute. This is a view of Chicago in the late 30s, the lakefront, Lake Michigan, Grant Park in front of downtown, the Loop. There are some high-rise buildings, and of course, Chicago was already famous for its architecture. After all, there was Louis Sullivan, Burnham, Frank Lloyd Wright. These were names that already had made an impact and were recognized as leading figures in architecture. Next. He was asked amazingly to me, here's a German non-speaking English architect who become the director of an architecture school, and the political relationship was moving towards war, and the school asked him to do a master plan. Remarkable. Only in America can this happen. And he developed, with some other people from the Bauhaus, by the way, many of you will know that he was the last director of the Bauhaus, but because of the Nazis didn't want the Bauhaus, it was closed in 1933. And but he took with him, or he persuaded several other people, including Peter Hans, Professor Peter Hans, and Hilbersheimer, an urban planner, to come with him to Chicago. And they did. And these people, together with some of their American colleagues, master planned the campus, the future campus for IIT. Interesting in the 60s, a journalist friend of mine inquired at the FBI about Mies van der Rohe and what papers they had. And lo and behold, there was a detailed written report about this group of German-speaking people planning a portion in Chicago. What are they planning? And that was the suspicion. And it was all reported to the FBI, but obviously nothing came of it because they're not planning any enemy adversarial activities. They were planning a better school for the youth of Chicagoland. So the famous building that came out of this early work is the Crown Hall, the architecture school at IIT in Chicago. I went there myself in the late 50s for a year and a half, and many hundreds of architects have gone there. This is what it originally looked like. It's a column-free, very large space, very flexible, with desks for the students and walls to hang drawings, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows with louvers to control the sun. It was not air-conditioned, and my desk was pretty much in the corner and on the southwest corner, and you can imagine it was pretty hot there in June and July and August. But it had a tremendous impact on everybody that went to school there. Another building in Chicago that was remarkable and made him famous in the US is the Farnsworth House. Dr. Edith Farnsworth was a doctor, medical doctor, unmarried, and she met him socially and persuaded him to make a design for her. And this took several years. They played around with this on a piece of land outside Chicago, about an hour from Chicago downtown, on the Fox River, which is a river that goes through Illinois and eventually flows into the Mississippi. The water flows into the Mississippi River. And because it is on that property near the water, that river occasionally floods after a strong winter and a lot of snow. Too much water that doesn't get absorbed fast enough, and the land here floods. And that's why Mies raised the house off the ground on stilts. And the amount of raising was roughly 5'6" something like 6 feet, which was recorded on a bridge nearby. That was the highest ever recorded flood. And a few years after the house was built, it flooded even more and higher, and ruined some of the furniture and walls, wood walls inside the house. The house has flooded a couple of times in its history, and it so far has not been possible to. I mean, there have been plans to move it to another location, but of course, everybody, or many people like myself, don't think that should be done. I personally am an advocate of a hydraulic system that can raise the house when the water comes, and then lower it again when the water goes away. So I have been involved with this with my dear friend Peter Palumbo out of London, who bought the house and owned it for a good number of years. He bought it from Edith Farnsworth, who moved to Italy, and he paid for the whole house only about $220,000, but spent more than that in fixing it, repairing it, repainting it, and so on and so on. It is basically a house for one person or one couple, because there's no more than one bed area, It's a small square footage space house, but quite remarkable and totally surrounded by nature and wonderful trees. And in front of it is the river, the Fox River. For Peter Palumbo, for my friend Peter Palumbo, he asked me to design some furniture for the house, which I did. And here you see a desk and a box, a shoe box. It is because when you walk to the house, you're not walking on paved granite sidewalks, but you're walking through some maybe slushy, muddy grassland. And you want to take your shoes off. And you could sit on this box, lift the lid, and put the dirty shoes in the box. That was the idea. The desk has these tablets on the right and left. You see them. They are cantilevered from the underside of the desk, and then some stainless steel brackets were designed that allowed you to put some books there because the whole house has no bookshelving. It was impossible to have a library there. So Mies in Chicago continued his trajectory to become well known and better known, and some important projects were given to him. You see two of them here, but I want to make a comment. He lived 30 years in Berlin, and 30 years in Chicago, almost exactly. Berlin he became famous for designs, not in Berlin, but in Czechoslovakia and in Barcelona, and these glass skyscrapers that were never built. He comes to Chicago, and he is booming with activity and invitations to design private homes, the Farnsworth House, and these apartment buildings here on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. You see the two on the left, steel and glass buildings, 860 and 880 Lakeshore Drive, built and designed around 1950. And on the right, the continuation of the same development, but with slightly modified buildings based on experience and lessons learned, such as air conditioning and window treatment, because the first buildings have single glazing and clear glass and no air conditioning. The window units were the solution at that time, because developers, builders didn't really pay for air conditioning. But the buildings are still being used. In fact, I live myself on top of one of them, and I love it very much. And they are very wonderful and very much appreciated in Chicago. The joke in town is that this is where more architects live than in any other building in the city of Chicago. He then, of course, in the 60s, and we already heard a little bit about the Toronto Dominion Center, was involved in a number of major projects. This here is the Chicago Federal Center, which has a courthouse building, the one you see in the center, and the post office on the right, the low building, and another building also on the right, not visible so much. But a Calder sculpture was acquired to be on the plaza, and the plaza is today, what is it, 60 or 70 years later. It's very active. We have almost daily protest events right there now with Palestinian people, pro-Palestinian protestations and so on. But it's a part of the city and very, very nice space and famous. The building is similar, or another building that was done a little later is the Seagram building. Here you see it in New York on Park Avenue, set back from the avenue with a plaza in front, some fountains, and the building's curtain wall is all bronze, not steel, not aluminum, but bronze material. And it is a very high quality, wonderful building, probably one of the finest buildings in New York City or anywhere, office buildings. And your company, NORR's connection with Phyllis Lambert and the Bronfman family is interesting to note, because Phyllis obviously was appointed to be in charge by her father for the Seagram building, and she became a very close friend of Mies's, and later moved to Chicago, and she lived on the top floor of one of the buildings where I now live, and at that time. And then later she moved back as she grew older, back to Montreal, where she came from, and created the Canadian Center of Architecture, which is a major architectural museum institution that I admire it very much, because it was created and collected the material by somebody who knows what's what and the significance of some of these things. So you have in Montreal a remarkable architectural museum. This is the IBM building, done in the late 60s at the end of Mies's life. I worked on it in the office next to the Marina City Towers by Bertrand Goldberg. I should mention also, because it's an interesting little detail, Bertrand Goldberg was a Chicago architect, did the Marina City Towers, as you see one of them here, right next door to the IBM building. But he was a student at the Bauhaus for several years, spoke German. And when Mies visited Chicago in 1937, Bertrand Goldberg met him at the train station, arriving from New York, and showed him Chicago. So they knew each other. Bertrand was a student at the Bauhaus in the 30s, late 20s, maybe. I don't know the details. But the IBM building is interesting because it is the first building of its kind with these glass curtain walls, metal curtain walls, that has insulating glass, and the metal frame is thermally broken, which means that the exterior metal and the interior metal frame are not touching each other. There's insulation between, and that means that the transfer of heat and cold is interrupted that way. So that building was a major development or improvement in the emergence of curtain wall buildings. And the building got an award from the federal government for doing that. Now we're going to Berlin. Of course, I came to Chicago when I was in my late teens and I graduated from the university, technical university in Munich, Germany, and IIT was also part of my education. But I spoke the language, And so it is that I was naturally involved in the development and construction of the new National Gallery in West Berlin at the time, in the 60s. Berlin was still a divided city, and this is very close to the Berlin Wall to the east. It's a steel roof, 6 feet deep. You see the scale here. There's a man standing on the corner, about the size of the depth. And it's a two-way grid, all welded together on the ground, and creates a column-free exhibition space. Great for showing large-scale contemporary art, which this is not here. This is Mondrian. The director of the museum wanted to show Mondrian in the museum when it opened in 1968, just at the end of Mies's life. Mies himself could not see the building completed. I represented him at the opening ceremony, and he died a year later. But the interesting thing is these pictures by Mondrian are very small, are very wonderful. The colors are very refreshing. And so I came up with an idea of hanging walls, and Mies accepted that. And these walls are very large walls. They're not standing on the floor because I didn't want to have the bracing and the brackets and the structure to make them stable. The hanging was a wonderful way to do this, and so you see, this is the opening exhibition in 1968. Interesting, I'll go back to the picture before. Interesting, the roof was assembled on the ground here as one big plate. And the steel fabrication company chose a day to raise hydraulically this roof, at which the German Concrete Institute had its national meeting in the Philharmonic Hall down here that you see in the background, which is the Berlin Philharmonic Hall by Hans Scharoun. Some of you may know who that is. And they had their meeting there, and they went in the morning, and they saw a big steel plate lying on the ground. When they went to their meeting and when they came out, lo and behold, the museum was there. It was raised up hydraulically, sitting on these columns that were dragged up with the movement. And this was the last time Mies himself came to visit and Berlin. And he wanted to go under the roof and see the spatial quality of that big roof and the open surroundings. And I went with him because he was walking crutches. He had severe arthritis, and he didn't care where he walked and where he stood. And I always made sure I was under one of the openings. So just in case the roof came down. Next. Now I'd like to show you a little bit of my work in the years that I've been practicing since his death in Chicago under my name. I've had firms over the years, Lohan Associates, Lohan Anderson, and now Lohan Architecture. And at one point I had up to 150 people. Now it's much smaller because I am sort of retired, but still active in the design. This is a project that I received in a competition from McDonald's Corporation to build their corporate headquarters on a campus outside Chicago. Interestingly enough, I had designed a building that was sort of Miesian, very rectilinear and hard-edged. And the chairman of the company said, "Well, but we want to hire you, but not Mies. I would like to see what you would do." And it was the first major challenge I got from some client, not to emulate and repeat Miesian architecture. That's not to say I'm not influenced. I am very much influenced by Mies. And to me, the technology and the development of glass and steel frames and so on, all is very, very important. I've done buildings along those directions. But this campus is a little more in the tradition of Midwestern architecture, brick, a lot of brick. So now you can show. And there are three buildings. One is the office headquarters, one is a hotel called the Lodge, and another one is a training center where people come from around the world to learn the secrets of McDonald's cooking. So it's a wonderful complex, but in recent years, or because it's in the suburbs, the company has divested itself of this because they couldn't find young people that wanted to work in the suburbs anymore, enough of them with the right background. And the young people wanted to live in the city again. So they have moved, McDonald's have moved its headquarters to Chicago downtown and in an office building. And this complex has recently been taken over by Ace Hardware as a corporate headquarters project. And it's concrete frame with brick walls and overhangs and wonderful environment with a park-like setting. Next. You see some images here. Next. That's another project that we did at Northwestern University. It's called the Block Museum. It's an art museum at Northwestern University, and the name Block refers to the major donor, art collector, the Block family, that gave their collection to the university. It's on the campus in Evanston, north of Chicago. Next, and obviously, as you can see, it has a Miesian quality. And the exhibition space is what you would expect. The only thing, if you look out to the window there where daylight is, I put a wall with art directly over the windows, which is a little unusual, but it works very well, as you can see here. Another building that we did is a high-rise office building, Clark Street. Directly behind it, you see a dark-skinned building. That's the IBM building. And behind that, you see a taller building. That is the Trump Tower by SOM here in Chicago. And they're all located right on the Chicago River with a nice view over the river into the loop. So this building is a normal office building with several law firms and businesses and restaurant, ground floor, and so on. What is maybe interesting here, you see the concave curved spandrels between floors. This was an idea I had that instead of making a flat spandrel, which all the buildings most of the buildings that you see have, I wanted to do it curved so that during daytime, the lower edge would be highlighted by the sunshine from above, and at night, the upper edge would be illuminated from the light of the streets, so that the building has a presence, its facade has a presence day and night, and it worked out very well. It's a popular building and very successful. Oh, well, like every architect, occasionally I was persuaded to do a house for somebody too. And this is a house in Michigan near Grand Rapids in the woods, a nice property, a clearing in the woods. And it's called now I can't think of the name. Anyway, it's a Rubik cube. All the elevations and the floor plans are a total cube, square. And the stair inside is a spiral, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4 levels. The top floor is a terrace to the outside with barbecue and seating to be outside in the sunshine. After a year or so after the house was done, the client called me, who, by the way, there's a little story to that. He had called Philip Johnson, the architect in New York that had worked with Mies in the past, if he would design him a Mies van der Rohe house. And Philip Johnson said, "No, don't. I don't do Mies houses anymore. Why don't you call Dirk Lohan? That's his grandson in Chicago. Maybe he can design you a Mies house." So I got the call from this client, and I said, "Sorry to tell you, to disappoint you, but I don't do Mies houses anymore either. But I'll do you a Dirk Lohan house." And he hired me. And so the top terrace, I want to make a little anecdote. He called me one day and said, "You're a genius." I said, "Why?" "Because we love going to the top floor and sitting outside, and we've learned there are no bugs, no flies, no mosquitoes coming around to disturb us." I said, "Well, did you know?" I said, "Well, that's why I put that terrace up there." And to tell you now the truth, I had no idea about this. I just thought it was a nice location. But I said, that's why I put it there. So it's a wonderful house. It's popular, and I'm proud of it. And I keep thinking maybe one day I will acquire it and live there myself. But that hasn't happened yet. Next. The couple of more buildings that I've done in Chicago, I've been very busy on the museum campus. This is the aquarium, the shed aquarium building that I did. It's called Oceanarium. Here you see a view on the inside where the seating is for the visitors and the pool for the animals. And they have this specifically is for dolphins and whales, which were hitherto not used in Chicago. And I designed this in such a way that the illusion is created. You're on a big ocean. You see Lake Michigan here outside the windows, and the pool in the front, and the staff is showing what the dolphins can do when you train them right. It's a popular building. Another thing that I have done is the 100th anniversary of the reversal of the flow of the Chicago River. It was commemorated with this fountain, which I designed near the lake entry, where the river used to flow into Lake Michigan. Now it flows from Lake Michigan into the hinterland, and that was done 100 years ago in order to keep the sewage, which was going into the river, from flowing into Lake Michigan. So we are sending it for 1 century already into rural Illinois. But no, now there's cleaning, of course, involved. But next. Well, my last project I want to show you is I've been very active over the recent years in designing part of the museum campus on our lakefront. This is downtown Chicago on the left, and Grant Park, the green area, and then the Field Museum, the big classical building, and to the right, the aquarium, and not visible, but further to the right is the planetarium. But when you go out into Lake Michigan. And of course, during the summer months, we have lots of harbor facilities for the yachts that people have. Soldier Field is the football stadium for the Chicago Bears. And 25 years ago, they hired us to update it with a modern facility, but didn't specify, didn't want to have a roof. Because they said, we're Chicago Bears, we're tough. We play in rain and snow, and the other teams come from enclosed stadiums. They don't like the cold, they won't perform so well. That was the logic. So that was done. We were the architects for it, as you see here. Also redone was the traffic situation around these buildings, because Lakeshore Drive is the big highway that connects north and south of Chicago along Lake Michigan. A beautiful drive. And Chicago is, in my opinion, one of the most attractive cities in North America because of its location on the lake. Here you see the plan of the stadium, and it had to fit into 2 colonnades that were memorials to the soldiers of World War I. It was built as a flat stadium with very bench seating and Greek colonnades. And you see a little bit on the right, some red color roof. That's the colonnades. We designed it to fit between the colonnades so that Soldier Field is still a memorial to the soldiers. Now, in recent years, here you see the stadium and the colonnades on the west side, the way they are. The Bears, for some reason, are no longer happy with this. They now want a roof. And they have even threatened to move out of Chicago to one of the suburbs of Chicago, where there was a horse race track no longer used. They bought that and already demolished it. But they now lost interest in that, and they are now proposing in the next few days, in fact, a brand new stadium for $3 billion to be located near here on the lakefront in the museum campus, which will be a major controversy in Chicago, because there was in recent years another plan by the Lucas Museum from the West Coast wanted to build a museum here in the same location, and lawsuits were filed by citizens and park enthusiasts that that wasn't possible and it was disallowed, and the Lucas Museum left town and went to the West Coast again. So now the Bears want to do the same thing, and there will be a lot of opposition, including mine, and I decided to show them how this stadium can be continued to be used with a roof over it. And this is my last picture of my talk. You see it here in that location where it is. We would build 4 corner towers, structural towers that hold up the roof so we don't have to have supports underneath the roof on the inside that impact the views of the spectators of the game. Um, this has not been published yet. You are the very first people seeing this design, and in the next few days, we will publish it here in Chicago. So, with this, shall we say, potential controversial project or interesting debate, as an architect, I feel you can't just always just think about design and structure and materials. You have to think about what's right and good for the people and for the city and for your community. And I think the stadium on the lakefront is very much needed and very much in keeping with what should be done in Chicago. And no additional park space and lakefront should be used to build buildings. This is built originally the soldier field to World War One, so it's 100 years old this year. I think. This year, not the roof, but the, the low end of it and the colonnades. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and your remarks. Thank you.
Dirk, thank you for that. Just a couple of things. I want to thank you for sharing the first 30 years and the second 30 years of Mies. And I want to say a few things about the last slide that you have up, compliments. I joined NORR on a similar stadium in Toronto that did have a roof. I guess our baseball team is not as tough as your baseball team, but
well, football.
Football. Yeah. We had football and baseball on ours, and at one point in time, we were in the same situation in Toronto where they were talking about tearing the building down. They finally came to their senses and they decided to keep the building. But I admire you for what you have up. This NORR will actually go live in about a week. So people will see this competition slide that you have up, and compliments on this, because I think that you're absolutely right. Buildings like this need to stay in the downtown area, and what you're suggesting here.
And let me just make one more comment. The Bears want to build their $3 billion new version right next to this, and then tear this down. Why?
Yeah.
They can get this for half the price.
Yeah, we had the same situation in Toronto a few years ago, and they decided to simply renovate it, and it's a good thing that they did. But I'm going to bring on somebody that has I think done a lot of work with you, and is an important person at certainly IIT. And if you can turn on his camera at this point, it's Michelangelo Sabatino, who trained as an architect, preservationist, and historian in Canada, Italy, and the US. He is a professor of architectural history and preservation at IIT's College of Architecture, where he directs the PhD program and is the inaugural John Vinci Distinguished Research Fellow. Since arriving in Chicago in 2014, Sabatino co-authored Modern in the Middle, Chicago Houses 1929 to 1975, that recently won the Modernism in America Award from Docomomo, US. Most recent books include Canada, Modern Architecture in History, Avant-Garde in the Core Fields, Architecture Landscape, and Preservation in New Harmony, Making Houston Modern, The Life and Architecture of Howard Barnstone, and most recently, Carlo Molino, architect and storyteller with Napoleon Ferrari in 2021. New books include Mies, On His Own Words, Writings, Speeches, and Interviews with Vittorio Pizzigoni, 2024. The Edith Farnworth House, Architecture, Preservation, and Culture, 2024. Amongst his forthcoming books is Building, Breaking, Rebuilding, the Illinois Institute of Technology campus and Chicago's South Side, co-edited with Kevin Haringworth, 2024. Michelangelo, welcome. If you can turn on your camera, please.
All done. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome to this session. And I think that you just saw a fantastic presentation with that Dirk just did. And if we can turn off the presentation, please. Presentation slide.
Great.
Perfect.
Oh,
Perfect.
Michelangelo, you're impressive. I didn't know you did that many books.
I will say to you, Dirk, that you are a treasure here for Chicago, and you have had a remarkable life in both of your own accomplishments and as being a steward of your grandfather's legacy. So I want to go on record for thanking you for being a generous guy and fun to be with. So I want to start the conversation rolling with that. So we are supposed to have a little bit of back and forth, some questions, and your presentation was remarkably dense, and so let's just move for first question. Knowing that there's a lot of Miesian fans or Mies fans in the background listening to us, but many of whom didn't go to IAT, many of whom didn't train directly with Mies. And yet there's an incredible, especially in Canada, if you think of John C. Parkin, John A. Russell, I mean, none of these guys went to IIT. They went to University of Toronto. They went to MIT. And so how is it possible? What led so many architects who did not directly train with Mies to embrace his architecture and be very successful at doing so? What do you think the sort of the lesson there is?
Well, I think Mies was a cerebral person. He read books on philosophy, and he was always interested and proud to speak clearly but minimally, meaning don't overuse the word when you could show something in reality, meaning in design, in building. I think his buildings and his influence is so remarkable because it is based on his understanding of the craft of designing on the one hand, and the other half is his understanding of our time, our period. What is the remarkable or this significant aspect of that? He spoke about this quite often. It's the development of technology and the use of new material, glass as a, well, glass was known, but it was never used that way before. And so I think that architects that came in contact with his buildings realized rather quickly and easily that they are very convincing and very clear cut and very simple to understand.
Right.
So um, there is a subtle persuasion in them.
Reinhold Banham wrote that outside of Chicago, Houston was the most Miesian city. In fact, and he was referring to Howard Barnstone and many others, of which we wrote a book about. And it was this idea that he could, architects that were in thrall of Mies, and remember, Barnstone is someone that trained at Yale and actually did his thesis with Kahn, but decided that he would sort of absorb the Mies lesson and temper his buildings to the climate of the golf course, coast Houston. So the lesson is there. David Haid, of course. Did you ever meet David Haid?
Yes. Oh, yes, I knew him. Yes.
For the Canadians who are with us tonight or today, Haid was, of course, a great architect that did the pavilion also here to the Ben Rose house that was done by A. James Spire. So Haid has an amazing trajectory here. So here, but Haid, in fact, trained at IIT after leaving Canada. So let's talk about teaching, Dirk. So what you don't see is Mies standing in front of a classroom at a podium, right?
No, that's true.
And the images that you have taken over the years, and certainly when he was alive, show him surrounded by students and faculty. So perhaps you can speak to the importance of both the written and the spoken word for Mies, since you were in contact, with him.
Well, the spoken word, as I said, he did not speak English when he came to this country. So it took him a while to catch up. And he used some younger assistants who had been at Bauhaus, like I mentioned, Bertrand Goldberg. Bertrand Goldberg, to my knowledge, never helped me in this way, but some others did. And I don't remember their names. That was before my time. But they spoke German and of course American. They were Americans, so that helped me. But some people also suggested to him that he go to the what's the school where you learn English by speaking. You don't learn official grammar and structure, but you just speak. It's a teaching methodology. I can't think of the name of the Berlitz, yes. And Mies went to the Berlitz school for a few sessions, and he asked the teacher always, well, can you tell me what the structure is, where the verbs should be, and this and that. And they didn't want to talk like that, and he left again. So he picked it up really by speaking it and through other people's social contacts and friends. And he, I said already, he used the cigar as a extended time very often. I remember him puffing. Well, you ask him a question and he didn't answer right away. And then he puffed on his cigar and then he said an important sentence. And he wrote some of these things were written down later. And he had a friend, Laura Marks, who helped him. She was highly educated and corrected the English and the vocabulary and so on. And
there was
go ahead.
There was he moved, so if we follow the trajectory of his time in Berlin to Chicago, he seemed to prefer the interview over sort of writing from scratch. That is sort of almost a Socratic method of like, being asked questions in which he would then reply. And so do you think that was his way also of like engaging students as well as practitioners?
Well, in later life, yes, you're right. That was true. I don't think that was really the method that was being used in Germany when he was fluent, because I noticed that he was always much more fluent and more humorous and funny when he used the German language.
Right.
So when I spent time with him, which was every week, one day, one evening, Thursday evening was my jour fixe. We started. I told him what's going on in the office, and we talked a little bit in English. But then sooner or later, we spoke German to each other, and I asked him always about his experiences in Berlin, because I was curious about how this all began and what he experienced. And for instance, this first client of his, Alois Riehl, R-I-E-H-L, professor of philosophy in Berlin, the house that you saw, the first one I showed. He urged him gave him books on philosophy. And Mies read all these, and when I inherited a collection of books, the majority of the books he had in his library were not on art and architecture, but they were on philosophy.
Right.
That interested him, and he was very, shall we say, committed in his own way of thinking, to think clearly and develop the structure of a sentence clearly.
Right.
So
absolutely. In fact, in writing the introduction to our Mies in his own words, I likened his use of language and words to placing bricks carefully in a, that very, you're right. He was basically unlike, Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright that were writing books every couple of months. Mies was much more selective. And again, the language challenges that you mentioned certainly were at the base of that. But also, when we think of the post-World War II years in America, mass media, television, came into play. And so there was a tremendous amount of, interviews that he gave, both radio and television, that helped sort of spread the Mies word in ways that actually, made him that much more of a public figure. In fact, there's a series that George Danforth, one of his students, the one that took on the directorship of the Department of Architecture once Mies left, that did this beautiful 4-part heritage series in which he asked Mies all these questions. And so I think that's a key part, to spreading the Mies word. But okay, that reminds me, just
But let me add a little anecdote to this. Well, you mentioned brick. He famous saying is architecture begins when you put 2 bricks carefully together.
Right.
You must have heard this before. Yeah. That's emblematic about his way of coming from the craft. And he was told me once a story when he came from Berlin. He'd already been in Berlin, and he went home to his father. And his brother said to his father, why did we spend so much time on this one thing on top of that building? Nobody will see it. It's not within view of people. And the father said, my dear, you need to, don't forget, God will see everything.
Right.
And God, Mies is famous for saying repeatedly to architects, to young architects, God is in the details. In other words, work out this small stuff. Then you can go to the big things.
Right. Absolutely. And that's what is so sort of powerful of this legacy. There's a quietness and attentiveness that
Yeah.
So, okay, you mentioned his early houses. The Alois Real house, of course, was an important, not so, only from an architectural point of view, but also in terms of entering a certain milieu,
Yes, right, right.
clients. So, in a way, Mies, not unlike Le Corbusier, that started out with more traditional houses, he then moved from the real house to the Farnsworth house, in America.
Yeah.
So while it might be easy to see these as totally disconnected, and in fact, he was not keen on, bringing attention to his Berlin work in that regard, is there anything that he learned, in the teens, from Germany through those single family houses that he might have carried over to, much more radical country houses like the Farnsworth house?
Well, one of the things that at least this is my interpretation, that he was fond of from the beginning and throughout his life in whatever he designed, particularly residential projects, to connect them to the outside, to nature, and opening it up. Whether that was done through making the windows bigger and bigger, or whether, like at the house I showed you, where the Orbic house, big terraces, huge terrace.
Right.
It was built where you could go outside, sit outside, and experience, hear the birds, and and feel the wind. And Farnsworth House is the same thing. There's interior experience with nature through the windows, and then there is the terrace, the loggia or whatever you want to call it, where you are outside under roof, but still no windows, and then the real terrace. That was very important to him.
Absolutely. In fact, there's some of the early Hedrick Blessing photos of the Farnsworth. Half of the photos actually outside of the house, and I think you're absolutely right on that front, that it's looking out was a kind of as important as looking in, and in a way, the Farnsworth, over the years, the country was taken out of the country house through a series of photographic reportages that I think did not do justice to it. But okay, so single family house, but when he came to America, with the exception of 3 houses, what made him the iconic and influential architect that he became across the globe was the tall building, the 868, 80, 900, 910, but even Promontory Point. So, he had a fascination for tall buildings. Was that, it started out, of course, in unbuilt projects in Berlin, but do you ever remember him speaking about his fascination for the tall building?
Actually, I can't immediately think of a conversation where he, but I mean, obviously to him, because of these early skyscrapers he did, that was an acceptable form of building.
Right.
That urban environment can have tall buildings, and one should have tall buildings. I think that is an influence that he adopted from America long before he ever had seen America.
Right.
But the very first building in Chicago was the Promontory building in Hyde Park, and the interesting thing is that the developer of these buildings, 860 and 880 and 900, 910, and several other in Detroit and so on, was more or less the same company or the same gentleman, Greenwald.
Absolutely.
who hired him to do these things. And Greenwald must have had a very positive impression of his ability to do this before he even saw what comes out.
Right.
I mean, it amazes me always because as a younger architect, you always struggle to get the next job. You know, and it's nice when clients have the confidence in you more so than you yourself have, maybe.
Right. And I'll just one point. Remember, you know, the work in Lafayette Park, Detroit, there was the pavilion was a tall building, right? So
Yeah.
the idea, so as if you know, promote pavilion, the idea of looking out, promontory point, of course, that was Caldwell. And so there's this real sense of looking out that goes from the one-story building all the way up to the tall building in the case of, you know, the pavilion in Lafayette Park and promontory. So that's certainly a thread, right? This
Yeah.
impulse to look out. It's not only about the seamlessness between outside inside, it's actually like a fundamental impulse to look outside, which I think, you know, can be traced back to sort of certain kind of a romantic German painting. In any case, okay, I'll keep you. I know that we don't want to keep our folks that are wanting to ask questions waiting. Let me ask you a couple more questions. You know, Mises buildings are now aging, right?
Yes.
And so there's a great challenge ahead of us in terms of how do we honor this legacy and also, you know, respond to certain environmental challenges, you know, energy challenges. And so in your experience, you know, you mentioned the hydraulic, you know, solution for Farnsworth, but that's slightly more an issue of flooding. But for those in the audience, the folks that are one day might have to take care of Mies buildings, what might you say to them?
It's very interesting because I have a direct quote there. I forget which building was it. There was a. Sorry, but I remember discussing with Mies something about preserving a building that he had done. I cannot at the moment recall which project that was. And it was, the question was, should it be torn down or should it be kept and remodeled? And I asked him, you know, I feel we're responsible for this. What should we do? And he said, after thinking again some time about the answer, he said, it's up to your generation to decide what to do with the past. And I think, personally, I think this is a very convincing answer. And all the aspects when you consider this, what to do with the past. There are, you know, we all are involved with preservation and keeping old buildings and fixing them and spending money on them. And then some others we don't do, and they get torn down. I'm right now involved in a very active discussion with the federal government, GSA, here in Chicago, behind the Dirksen Federal Building, Mises Building. On State Street, there's a whole half a block that is deteriorating and falling apart. And the federal government has owned these buildings for over 20 years, but they're not being preserved. And the preservation groups in Chicago are very actively lobbying to preserve and maintain them and fix them.
Right.
So it's one of these things. But when I apply Mises' thinking, he would say clearly, it's for you to decide what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, as you were involved here on our beautiful one room schoolhouse with Crown basically being rebuilt in 2005. That is, stripped down to the
Yeah.
steel, or even more recently with the Farnsworth House, the travertine is being replaced. The single pane windows are being, replaced, so much so that, those who are a little too orthodox in terms of issues of authenticity might get a little concerned. But in fact, buildings have lives. And I know that you were involved, and I'll maybe end with this question. I know you were consulted, as you should have been, with Chipperfield's work at the Neue Nationalgalerie. Maybe you
Yeah.
can share just a couple of um, last remarks about the kind of nitty gritty about, like, what was involved with trying to get this building. As one colleague said to me recently, it's better now than it ever was in
It's
terms
correct. It's correct. I agree with that.
of. Okay,
But
let's close with.
it is better in my opinion because it wasn't redesigned architecturally. It was just improved in materiality, in uh, function, and so on. Anyway, David Chipperfield is a very sensitive guy. I know him quite well, and I was part of it. I was a consultant to the team because I had made most of the decisions during its construction originally in the 60s. I was a very young architect, but somehow it worked. I remember being 29 years old or so and having a meeting with senators and the leadership of the Berlin um, uh, government. And one of the senators said, "Mr. Lohan, how old are you actually?" And I said, "I'm 32," which was a lie. I'm sorry to tell you this, but it's the only lie I remember ever telling. But I knew that you had to be 30 plus to be taken seriously. You know, it's very hard when you're in your 20s.
Well, you've always been a wise man.
So,
Well,
that building was a wonderful experience, and David Chipperfield and his office in Berlin, which is a wonderful office. I know them very well. They are good people. They are very creative people and sensitive people. And that's why they're getting so many cultural buildings to fix. There is the Alte, not the Neue Nationalgalerie, but the Alte National, the old one, that was not fully destroyed, but damaged quite a bit during World War II, particularly at the end of the war with the Russian occupation. And that building sat there all through East Berlin, all through the 60s, and they hired the Chipperfield office in the 80s, I think, to repair it or fix it. And Chipperfield left some of the damage in place. So when you go in there, you experience the history of this building, and you
right.
can see how it was built and what was damaged. I don't know. It's the first time I had that experience because most preservationists want to restore everything to the original condition.
Right, right.
Yeah, I'm glad that Michelangelo, that you brought that up, and we're ending on the Chipperfield building, because we had a NORR ed in January, and David Chipperfield said to me he didn't really want to talk about his buildings, but he did talk about a few of his buildings. He talked about that building and what it meant to him. So if you have a chance to watch that on NORR ed YouTube, you should watch it. Dirk, I wanted to just briefly, talking about that building and talking about Mies's buildings, the project in Toronto, the Toronto Dominion
Yeah.
Center, they were, I mean, certainly he came to Canada. I think from what I know, it's the only project. I might be wrong, but I think it's the only project that he did in Canada, and it was a composition of two, two towers and a pavilion, and that pavilion, the banking hall at the TD Center, is one of the most elegant buildings that you can go into, and it seems to be a theme, and it's like the Berlin building we were just talking about. It's like Crown Hall. It's one of those spaces that you can walk into and admire, not only from the inside but from the outside. Now, banking isn't done the way that used to be done in the 60s any longer, but that pavilion is still there, and it's a beautiful piece of architecture. You were probably there at the time in the beginning of the 60s in the office. I mean,
Right, I was.
what was that time like, and what was the that design like when you were working on it? And I'll just mention one other thing. I did some work in the towers, and at the time that I was doing some work as NORR in that building, Cadillac Fairview felt that the actual towers were the best planned towers from a planning point of view that they had in their entire portfolio. And I remember doing other schemes for Cadillac Fairview, and they kept saying to us, stop doing these 45-degree angles on your office plates. Stop doing this. Just copy the TD Center floor plate because it's perfect. The stairs are right. The cores are right. Just stop doing that. You can never replace Mies van der Rohe's floor plates. Anyways, what was it like back in the beginning of the 60s?
Well, the office was quite busy at that time, and Mies was, of course, aging, and but there were some capable people like Gene Summers. Have you ever heard that name?
Yeah.
He had been working with Mies for some time, and was a very capable guy and a very close friend to Phyllis Lambert. They met each other doing the planning of the Seagram building in New York, because Gene Summers was the right-hand architect for Mies. And later, well, I don't need to talk about that, but there were groups of people. The Toronto Dominion Center was a key player was Peter Carter from England. Obviously, because he was British, he had more of a connection to Canada than, let's say, some of us. Certainly not me, because that's why I was active in Berlin and other places. But Mies's office did several other things in Canada, particularly in the Montreal region, the island of Montreal, and
Nuns Island.
what?
Nuns Island.
Nuns Island, yes.
Westmount Square.
Yes, yeah, Westmount Square, yes. And there was a talk at the end of his life, or later in the 60s, and I was involved with that, even with Phyllis and with Cadillac Fairview, to do a major development in downtown Montreal with towers. But somehow it didn't happen. As we all know, these things sometimes happen. Projects get talked about, but don't get executed. And I think that the success of the Mies high-rise building and its proliferation throughout, certainly the US and Canada, you could say, but maybe even a little bit through the world, I'm glad it didn't reach more more quantities because it was too much of copying, too much of the same. And I myself, as a younger architect, always asked myself, well, I don't want to copy my grandfather's work. I am convinced that I managed to add in many cases a feeling of warmth, comfort, and humanity. Take the McDonald's project. It's a very warm, makes you feel good to be there. While many people I have experienced in my own discussions with people that they were emotionally not willing to accept some of the stark Mies work. They called it cold. Now, whether they are right or not is a whole nother topic. The point is that's how people reacted. And I know that the postmodernism had a lot to do with what was going on with these buildings. For some of the younger architects, there was too much of it going on, too much copying, too much, everywhere you could see these buildings with the same curtain wall by other architects, not by me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to bring on George from our George Soret, Phyllis George from our Chicago office. Welcome, George.
Hi, George.
And George has been capturing the questions that have come in through chat. George, do you have some questions from the audience?
George, you're muted.
George, you're muted.
All right, there we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Dirk. I was just saying, it's like every time you talk, I've seen bits and pieces of this presentation, but each time there's something new that you bring to us. So with the time we have left here, maybe 2-3 questions as I'm scrolling through the chat. Could go first one from Cynthia Varnes Olsen, who is a student of the school, professor at IIT, but then as well, she's the president of the Mies Society, and I encourage everyone to please go online and support what we do at the Mies Society, Dirk being really one of the founders of the society, supporting Mies's legacy and helping to restore the buildings. But on to Cynthia's question. Okay, so as we know, do you think that Mies's childhood domestic surroundings may have shaped his thinking as he approached his later design for the Tugendhat house, knowing that Mies never lived in an enclosed glass space in Chicago? Why do you think that was?
Well, there's an anecdote that may or may not be true, but it has the ring of truth to me. Herbert Greenwald, the developer of these apartment buildings in Chicago, persuaded him or gave him one of the apartments. He said, you could have one of these and you could live there. And Mies thought about it for a while and turned it down and said he doesn't want to move there. He lived in an old building, brick and punched windows. Nice old, building on Pearson Street, not only a couple of blocks from the apartment buildings on Lakeshore Drive. But the question was, why did he not accept it? And some of us said, well, Mies has a fairly good sized art collection. He had Paul Klee and Kandinsky and Picasso and various people on his walls. And there was not enough wall space in one of these glassy apartments in his buildings to hang all the art. And that might be one reason. And when he was told about that, he said, no, that's not the reason. The reason is that I'm afraid to go and take the elevator and have my neighbors complain about the plumbing that doesn't work. So he
You're
had,
all architects, yes.
yes. So I mean, I think, yeah, it's interesting. In Berlin, he also lived in a not in one of his buildings.
So
Very interesting.
another question here from David Cluzio, our director of design in Toronto. Thanking you for the presentation, but also if there were to be one thing that you could pass on that you learned from your grandfather and inspired you in your work, what would it be? That's a tough one, bringing it down to one item.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, I think the one thing that I'm interested in, and when I read books and when I pull books, I like to read to better understand our world as it is in our time, because I know that he was very serious about this, trying to understand the time and what is the essence that distinguishes our time from another time. And what convinced him was the technological development that it was going on and is still going on, even in a more accelerated way today. And I'm sure, like many people today, are struggling to keep up with it and understand the latest possibilities. My computer is full of webinars about new things and the climate issues, sustainability, and so on and so on. And but what makes us? Are we building a better world or not? Is a good question that I could throw out, and I give some thought to that, and I don't know that I have the answer yet. Sometimes it seems to me we're not building a better world.
But, you know, maybe, Dirk, one thought I had, and it's not a question here from the chat, but as you were talking, I'm thinking just about myself and others coming out of school and practicing in the mid 80s, late 80s. And you'd mentioned postmodernism, which was a reaction to
Yes.
what was happening with the modern movement, and partly this repeat and rinse that you were sort of alluding to. But modernism prevailed. Mies's work prevailed, sort of his ideas prevailed. So why do you think that is?
Well, right now, I agree with you. I think there is a stunning interest in Mies at this time again. Well, one reason is the substance of his work, that it was serious work and not frivolous, that it was an expression of, call it 20th century. And I think also that now he's belongs to the history. And it is easier, I think, to, I mean, for instance, IIT is a good example. There are, I don't know, 20 buildings by Mies on that campus. Cynthia, you would know how many, but and IIT is preserving that campus, which I think 10 years ago, there was no real serious interest in that.
Yes, 20, Cynthia just confirmed for us.
He is one of the giants of the 20th century, and there are some other people too, of course. But we are taking his work very seriously these days again. And when you see what's being published, not only in magazines, but really books-wise, and Michelangelo is a good example of that. It's amazing. It's amazing.
I would maybe just say that Mies is the classic, whether it's Shakespeare or others. You know, we continue to perform Shakespeare, whether in sort of interpretations or the literal. And so Shakespeare posed sort of fundamental existential questions about the human condition. And so Mies, like Shakespeare, continues to be alive, I think, amongst us. And because of the level of the questions that he was posing to himself, first off, and then through architecture.
Yeah, good answer.
I think that that's a great ending
Yes.
to this session. And one of the reasons that I think that, we had to do this. And with that, thank you, George, for that question.
Super.
Michelangelo, thank you. And good luck on all of your upcoming books. And I'm sure that you'll double or triple your books. And all the best to you with the students at IIT and your future. And we'll be in touch for sure in the future. Thank you very much for doing this. And Dirk, that was a fantastic presentation. I think everybody that's on the line, both the architects, engineers, all of the other people that are on, but in particular the students from the schools of architecture that are on, I know have appreciated this particular session. It's very rare that we have somebody that's actually not only a family member, but an architect and the grandson of a great architect do one of these master series for us. And we sincerely thank you for doing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for letting me do this.
And thank you, Silvio, for keeping, NORR Ed up and running.
Thank you all. And everyone that's on the line, we'll see you in a month from now with the next one. All the best. Thank you all.